Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
All right, well, let me ask you about this. So you say it's not a shakeup, but you guys are down. And it makes
Says
sense
who?
that there would...
Says
polls,
who?
most of them. All of them?
Says who?
Polls. I just told you, I answered your question.
Okay. Which polls?
All of them.
Okay. And your question is?
Okay, so my question is, I don't think it is really surprising when facing a challenge and trying to make a turnaround that there would be some, let's at least say some adjustments, okay? So I guess what my real question is here that I did not get to is, what is the point of this? If you're calling it an expansion of winners, as you put it, working on the campaign, what is it about? To what end?
As we noted, you are listening to a repeat of a show we first ran in December, a mythical time when Trump's nomination was unthinkable and, according to 538's Nate Silver, unsupported by the numbers. Silver told us that despite Trump's claim at the time that he was ahead in the polls, he was actually polling at about 8%, if you figure that he had 25% of the 25% of self-declared Republicans.
It's not that hard to get 6% or 8% of people to say much of anything in a poll. I mean, 6% of people, I think, told Gallup a few years ago that they thought the moon landings were staged.
In other words, Silver suggested that Trump's popularity was kind of a lie. He also noted that history shows that the American people are not likely to vote for a person like Trump. In March, after Trump defied the pundits and history to clinch the nomination, we spoke to Nate again and asked him what the hell happened.
There's not a lot of precedent for something like Donald Trump. I mean, this is something pretty amazing, and I don't know. I guess I don't feel that bad about having been initially skeptical.
Okay, I hear you, but I want to know about what you do feel bad about. I mean, the thing is you've got numbers, you're used to reading them a certain way. So is there somewhere where you went wrong or not? You read numbers for a living.
I do, and those numbers still suggest that it's very unusual for a candidate to win the nomination with as much opposition from within his own party as Donald Trump. I mean, there are a couple of issues here. One is extrapolating from history and realizing that we don't have that many examples. We have only one election every 4 years. And that maybe a lot of things that were true from the period from, say, 1980 through 2012, well, that sounds like a lot, but it's also still just one election every 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, we said, well, Donald Trump is someone who's going to be vigorously opposed by Republican Party elites. So because it's so consequential, they'll find some way to stop him. Well, maybe not.
You mentioned historical precedent. How many elections are we really talking about to base these predictions on?
Well, since 1972, which is when you had the McGovern reforms and you started to have people actually vote in primaries, before it sort of literally was smoke-filled rooms. It's depending on how you count, somewhere on the order of 10, 12, 15. To say something hasn't happened in 12 tries is much different than when we also make sports predictions and we can say, well, this hasn't happened in 1,000 games. Then you're more existentially certain that something is really unlikely than you can be in the nomination process, or for that matter, the general election too, where there have been, I think, 16 or 17 now elections since World War II in the polling era. That's not a huge sample size either.
One thing that historians have noted is that there are political realignments every 40 years or so. This is when the parties kind of break apart and reassemble somehow. Describe a couple of political realignments. What happened in those elections? And whether you think we're in one of those right now.
You had the New Deal coalition in 1932 or so, where you had overwhelming majorities of voters were voting Democrat, both for FDR and for Congress. That was very sudden and very dramatic. The more recent transition was a little slower. It certainly started at about 1968 with Nixon's Southern strategy. You could argue it didn't fully culminate until 1994, when Republicans won back a lot of seats in Congress in the South. I mean, people forget that it was a Democratic South, right? And the governor of Alabama was sure going to be a Democrat. He might have been George Wallace or someone who would not have very much in common with a Democrat in New York City, but certainly a capital D Democrat still. And that took some time to unravel. But, I suppose I'm not sure whether the GOP is going through a transition suddenly or if it'll take a couple cycles. But I am just saying that as someone who was skeptical, a lot of people were, but we were certainly skeptical about Donald Trump's ability to do what he's doing because the consequences would be so large for the GOP. Now that it's happening or on the verge of happening, we still think the consequences are really enormous. And it's a little bit like looking up and seeing that the sky is no longer blue, but orange.
Last week you joked on Twitter that, quote, with the exception of the 2016 election, will be a common phrase in PhD dissertations in 2044.
We're pretty good at placing events into context after we have some window of perspective. Somehow or another, by 2044, the 2016 election will fit into the narrative that we tell about how elections work. I do want people to understand how amazing it is as someone who covers elections. There are a lot of false alarms. There are a lot of elections where prognosticators cry wolf and say something new and different has happened when it wasn't. But this one, we almost feel like instead of wanting to calm everyone down and saying, no, you probably won't have a contested convention. No, you probably won't have a third-party candidate running. We have a different role this year. We want to be able to point out, like, this kind of breaks so many rules that we have to now consider what rules that we previously held to be true might also be wrong.
Nate, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Weren't sure about that, were you?
No, I totally am sure.
Nate Silver is the founder and editor of the data news site 538.com. He's also author of The Signal and the Noise, Why So Many Predictions Fail, but Some Don't. And 538 is our collaborator during this election season. We began this show about lies with Donald Trump. After all, as we've heard, he's broken the mold in that regard. But the people who support him, what does that say about them?
When he talks about especially immigration control and the border, he doesn't care what people think.
Unchoreographed.
He is honest.
I like his roughness and little Reagan-esque.
He's not a politician.
He's not going to be, like he said, I won't be bought off.
Trump is a threat.
Yep.
Because he doesn't fit in the same box all the other Republicans are in.
He's like one of us. He may be a millionaire, which separates him from everybody else. But besides the money issue, he's still in tune with what everybody is wanting.
He said he'll put a wall down on the southern border.
Right.
When you talk about common sense, that's the common sense thing to do.
We've got people in positions of power who I know for a fact are liars. Liars. I watch the TV. My president comes on the TV and he lies to me. I know he's lying. He lies all the time.
Look for him.
I don't believe any one of them, not one. I believe Donald.
Exactly.
I'm telling you, he says what I'm thinking.
Exactly.
Never been involved in politics, never had an interest in any of it. Now suddenly he is resonating. He is resonating with the people and he's speaking our minds, our minds. When the pundits and the experts and all the people who are supposed to be in the know and know all this stuff, and they're so great, I know some of them, maybe not all, but some of them are lying to me straight to my face, and I am so sick of it.
According to Michael Lind, co-founder of the New America Foundation, what the rest of us think it says may be the most insidious lie of all, the one we tell ourselves about those other people. The lie or myth that explains to us how they could ever possibly disagree with what we know to be true.
For about half a century, if not longer, the right's fundamental narrative has been that liberals or progressives are snobbish, upper-class, unpatriotic traitors. The progressive narrative is that no person could possibly disagree with liberal positions like subsidizing, wind and solar power, unless they were emotionally disturbed and ignorant, or probably a combination of both. There's like this constant fear on the part of progressive intellectuals that at any moment their fellow citizens will turn out to be secret Nazis and round everybody up. This undermines the progressive politicians for obvious reasons. You can't go, and try to win over people who are voting for Republicans saying, vote for me, you crypto-fascist ignoramuses.
Where did they get this idea?
I would argue they got this from Marxist immigrants from Weimar Germany who fled Hitler, Herbert Marcuse.
And sociologist Theodor Adorno?
Exactly. And Max Horkheimer. Marxism claimed that the working class should rally behind the Marxist intellectual vanguard, and in fact that had not happened in the countries of Europe. And so they came up with a theory that the working class did not know its own interests. It suffered from so-called false consciousness. And so then they applied this in the 1950s in the United States, a much different society. There would be a lot of working class and middle class support, particularly for McCarthy, whom they tended to view as a kind of Hitler-type figure. Again, these are European immigrants, so they're interpreting American politics through the lens of their traumatic experience.
You also cite the historian Richard Hofstadter.
That's right. In addition to Marxist immigrants, more moderate, centrist, northeastern liberal intellectuals, including Richard Hofstadter, Peter Viereck, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., tended to be upscale, very well-educated reformers with a very rationalistic approach to public policy. And they tended to interpret Americans who did not share their support for Adlai Stevenson and John F. Kennedy and so on as being irrational, ignorant people who were a danger to a civilized constitutional democracy. And I think the blend of these two strains of thought, the Marxist explanation of why the white working class does not rally behind left-wing socialist intellectuals, and this more centrist liberal explanation, trying to explain the phenomenon of McCarthyism and support for Barry Goldwater, and later for Ronald Reagan. I think these have essentially written the narrative that a lot of progressives unthinkingly rely on to this day. And their evidence for this is simply that people do not share liberal politics.
Let me get a clear idea of why Adorno and Hofstadter are wrong about the vulnerability of the masses to fascism.
Well, for one thing, the history simply doesn't work. And it particularly does not work for the McCarthy 1950s because that was the golden age of the American white working class and of capitalism. It was booming. Now, in the case of Nazi Germany in particular, the more recent scholarship shows that Hitler's support was not based on the alienated white working class, mainly because of the Depression. He had solid support across every class of German society because he appealed to a common German patriotism. He also appealed to very widespread anti-Semitic and racist attitudes. They were simply right-wing German nationalists. It wasn't because they were emotionally disturbed losers.
The main political story of the Obama years was arguably the rise of the Tea Party, which is made out to be this unruly populist movement that harnessed an overwhelming conservative American discontent, right? And yet President Obama won the 2012 election by a landslide.
Well, that's right. But the actual coalitions do not fit into either the progressive or the conservative narrative, which is based on class. That is, the Republicans supposedly representing the working class, liberals, representing the elite. In practice, our politics is based more on region, ethnicity, and race and religion than it is on class. Catholic Americans, for example, tend to be split between liberals and conservatives, and the division is how frequently you attend church. The more observant Catholics are Republicans. The less observant Catholics are Democrats.
I believe truly that Trump is appointed by God to lead this nation back the direction it needs to go.
Donald Trump has answered to our prayers.
He is the man for this time in history, and God will use him. And I don't know that he's going to even be aware of how God is going to use him.
You don't think he even knows what his relationship with God is?
Absolutely, I think that.
class is actually fairly minor in determining partisan affiliation compared to region, religion, and race.
So is the issue here then, if you are a liberal and you judge these people based on their fundamentalist beliefs of the Bible and all of that, then you're failing to see their potential as a force for liberal economics.
Exactly. The goal of politics is to put together coalitions of people who disagree about everything except for the particular purposes of the coalition. So if you want a coalition for universal paid family leave, why would you turn away someone who believes in the literal story of Noah's Ark?
What do you think about the idea of loving thy neighbor?
You don't want somebody living next door to you that's going to sneak over and murder you in your sleep.
Who's going to do that?
Muslims?
Who cares? You want their vote for family leave. Now, there are some things that are so fundamental to American citizenship, such as non-discrimination racially, I would argue non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender, that these are non-negotiable subjects for progressives and rightly should be. But on the other hand, the religious right has lost almost all of the battles in the last 50 years. The Supreme Court, dominated by Republicans, has legalized gay marriage and gay rights, and as well as abortion. That's not going to be turned back. Why turn away religious people? If you look at polls, they actually tend to be somewhat progressive on some social issues, Wall Street reform, pro-family policies like child care. And so you can have enlightened progressive government without giving the U.S. population a Mensa test and flunking half the population.
You say that these narratives that are put forth by the parties and repeated by the media not only fail to hold up factually, but fail politically too, because they leave a considerable swath of the public out in the cold? These are people who are too liberal to be conventionally conservative and too conservative to be liberal.
That's exactly right. Trump and Huckabee, two of the populists, have attacked the Republican Party for wanting to cut Social Security and Medicare, because their white working class voters depend upon it. The number of white Americans who want to combine less immigration with preserved or expanded Social Security and Medicare is enormous. It's nearly 50%. No one in either party represents pro-Social Security, anti-immigrant voters. And yet they're a huge part of the population. The conservatives have adopted the anti-immigrant theme, but at the same time, the mainstream conservatives all want to cut Social Security and voucherize Medicare, which their own voters don't want to do. 33% of Democratic voters want to cut immigration. Only 20% want to expand it. And yet that view is not represented in the Democratic Party. When you get large groups in the population whose combinations of particular policies do not fit the combinations on offer by our two parties, you get a substantial part of the electorate turning to outsiders because of a lack of any other choices.
Do you see any sign that these myths are abating?
No, I think they're worsening as a result of two phenomena. One is what has been called the sorting geographically. There tend to be very few conservative Republicans in Manhattan and very few liberal Democrats in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in terms of message, we live in the world of clickbait. The most inflammatory progressives and the most inflammatory conservatives are going to shout out the more nuanced people on the left and the right. Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine just described Trump followers as knuckle draggers. He compared them to apes, and liberals all cheered him on. None of this is new. But what you need is some kind of political system which is capable of transcending these divisions instead of just pouring more gasoline on the fire. And we don't have that at the moment.
Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michael Lind is co-founder of the New America Foundation and a contributor to Politico.
Tell me lies, tell me sweet little